Last week, U.S. President Donald Trump hectored leaders of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, during their meeting in Brussels, leaving many questions about the future of the alliance and what it means for Canada's role in the almost 7 decades-old coalition. Joining us now on that, in our nation's capital, Paul Robinson, Professor of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, Stephen Seidman, Pattison Chair in International Affairs, Carleton University, and with us here in studio, we've got Janice Stein, the Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and Erica Simpson, Professor of Political Science at Western University. From my hometown, London, Ontario, welcome. Nice to have you all here.
Nice to be here.
We've got so much to get into, but first, let's look at some background information on what NATO is. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a military alliance created in 1949, largely to block Soviet expansion into Europe. It had 12 member states at the time, including America, Britain, and France. Today, NATO has 28 members, including most of Europe, representing a population of more than 900 million. Its central purpose is set out in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which says that an armed attack on one or more members shall be considered an attack on all. Article 5 has been invoked once in NATO's nearly 70-year history. On September 12, 2001, less than 24 hours after the 9/11 attacks. And here's a clip from President Trump's speech to NATO last week, where he was dedicating a monument to commemorate NATO's response to 9/11.
The NATO of the future must include a great focus on terrorism and immigration, as well as threats from Russia and on NATO's eastern and southern borders. These grave security concerns are the same reason that I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations.
There's been many articles written about everybody's reaction when Trump was giving that speech. I want to go around and get everybody's reaction to his trip to NATO. Stephen, I'd like to start with you. How would you characterize Trump's trip and speech?
It could only have gone worse had he actually punched the Prime Minister of Montenegro. It was a disaster. There was an expectation that he would at least say the magic words, Article 5 and the American commitment. And I thought ahead of time that that wouldn't mean much because Trump doesn't really keep any commitments. But the fact that he omitted that entirely was a strong signal that standing in front of a 9/11 memorial where we were marking the losses that the alliance, Canada and Europe, sacrificed in Afghanistan on behalf of the United States, and he hectored them in a way that was very insulting, was a disaster, and it was part of a larger piece with the rest of his trip.
Paul, I want to get your reaction in a second, but Stephen mentioned Article 5. Janice, how significant was this omission?
It really was significant. I mean, the core of any alliance structure is one for all. And that's really what Article 5 says. If one of the members is attacked, the other members will come to their defense. So for Trump to omit that is really sending a message that this alliance is on very shaky ground. It's frankly really stupid. It's really stupid because it undermines the American commitment to the security of NATO members. It can't help but weaken the alliance, and I think this president will regret that.
Well, I don't think we heard anything from Trump that he hasn't said before. It was a fairly stock Trump speech. In that sense, I think really not at all surprising. And I don't imagine there'll be any particular consequences from it. It's not as if NATO is just going to disintegrate overnight. There's too many institutional interests holding it together. And it's not as if someone's suddenly going to attack NATO because Trump has said this. I mean, that's not going to happen either. So the actual consequences for the security of ordinary Canadians or ordinary Europeans will be pretty much zero, I'd have thought. So, you know, it's a kind of story, I think, which gets a lot of play and people who care a lot about institutions and so on. But in terms of its actual real consequences, pretty much limited.
Well, another thing that he did mention was he called out NATO countries for not paying their fair share in defense. In 2014, at a meeting in Wales, NATO urged members to move toward the target of spending 2% of GDP on defense by 2024. And here's how those countries are faring. Only 5 of the 28 NATO countries are spending 2% or above. That includes the United States, Greece, Estonia, UK, and Poland. And I'm really surprised that Canada is spending just above 1% of GDP on defense. Erica, was Trump right to call out people for not meeting their target?
Well, I think by threatening and by saying that they might not honor Article 5, there's no quicker way to get the European allies to think about spending more on conventional defense. So unfortunately, that's one way of frightening them. The Poles are frightened if Article 5 of the Russians, so they're frightened, and that's one way to get them to spend more. But does that mean we should respond to that threat? The United States, he wants to raise defense spending to $603 billion. So that's as much as China and Russia together. So Russia is spending $69 billion last year. The United States, he wants to spend $603 billion. So
that's a lot of money.
That's a huge amounts of money to be spent on defense. And so we are being criticized. Canada does spend only 1.1% of our GDP on military
Why
right
is
now.
that? Like, I'm surprised to see that Greece is spending what it is spending on Canada.
It's dropped, but if you look at per capita spending, we have a lower population, 31 million people. We spend 417 US. The Americans spend about 1,800. So they spend 4 times as much as us. But that's been consistently over time. If you use GDP, that's one way of making us look bad. Yeah. And so to look good, we've got to talk about per capita spending and other ways of committing to Europe.
So Eric's point, it's all about how you measure this, right? And these numbers really do make us look bad. But first of all, let's put on the table, the United States spends an absolute amount more than everybody else put together. So nobody needs to match the United States in defense spending. That's not even realistic. Secondly, the way you count what constitutes defense spending really matters too. So that's the actual budgetary allocation. But, for example, Canada is going to deploy troops in Latvia. That's not counted. So
there's other ways to contribute.
Of course, and like everything else, what you measure is what you see, and this set of measures makes Canada look really bad.
The Latvians are only spending $207. We spend $447 per capita. So we're helping the Latvians. So we're helping in other ways, just as Janice is saying.
Paul, I want to ask you this. Is 2% the right number to look at?
No, I mean, measuring defense spending as a proportion of GDP is not a rational way of measuring defense spending. I'll just quote one analyst on this who said that GDP is everything a country produces from nuclear bombs to hamburgers. If you eat more hamburgers, your GDP goes up, right? And if you've linked your defense spending to GDP, that means you must spend more on defense. But that makes no sense. Why do you spend more on defense? Because you're eating more hamburgers. This is not a logical way of determining how much you spend on defense. You determine how much you spend on defense based on assessments of threats and on your assessment of the utility of military power in dealing with those threats. Now, that may be 2%, but it might be 0.5%, it might be 0%, it might be 4%, it might be 10%. And it will vary from country to country and from time to time. And to link it to a suspiciously round and very arbitrary percentage of GDP is not a rational form of defense planning.
And if you actually take Trump's speech for a second, I mean, just to elaborate on Paul's point, take Trump's speech. What did he put on the table? 2 big threats from his perspective. Immigration. Well, NATO has nothing to do with setting immigration targets or controlling immigration or providing domestic security in countries that are big immigration receivers. So one of the main goals he's outlined for NATO, totally irrelevant to defense spending. Terrorism, which is the second one, effective terrorism responses, the key component of that is intelligence spending, not defense spending, and intelligence sharing. None of that is in the measure that the president used. So this was the most disconnected discussion, spending unrelated to the goals that he himself set that one could imagine.
Stephen, I see you trying to get in.
Yes, I've got 3 quick points. First, any measure that has Greece as a good ally is problematic because Greece does not show up And one reason why Greece looks good is because its economy is tanked. So the best way actually to meet 2% is to tank your economy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that one of the problems with Trump's argument here is that we shouldn't be expecting 2% today. He's making arguments about 2% today when the decision in Wales was 2% by 2024, which is aspirational anyway. But even if you want to say that's a real target, it's not 2024, it's 2017. So we got 7 years to get there. The third thing, and what people have overlooked, is that he put everybody in the same basket, which is everybody who's under 2% is a failure, according to him. And that undermines what people have been trying to do, that a lot of NATO has now been moving more towards spending more money, that there's been a pattern of cuts over the course of the past several years. But with Crimea, with Putin's aggression, there's been a move by many countries in Europe to spend more, but they're not at 2%. And he basically said that all those countries that are spending more get absolutely no credit. They're all in the basket of countries that haven't spent enough. And that's a real problem because these countries, these leaders, are facing a lot of pressure to spend money elsewhere. They're coming out of the 2008 recession. They're coming out of austerity, and they're being asked to spend more money in the military. Nobody in those countries wants to do that. Nobody in Canada. You don't see the NDP, you don't see the Liberals or the Conservatives jumping up and down and saying we really need to spend more money in defense as opposed to other interests. So the way he pouched that speech was really problematic from the standpoint of the domestic politics of all the allies.
Yeah, and just to take Paul's point on earlier that the speech didn't matter because institutions are long-standing and they're robust and nothing immediate is going to happen. But look what's on the table, actually, an aspirational goal for alliance members to deepen their commitment and increase their spending, right? And everybody's reaching toward 2024, and some will make a version of that, but they'll do more. Well, then you have the president coming and saying, I don't know, Article 5 really doesn't matter. It's not clear at all. I'm not going to talk about that. Why then should anybody do anything more? So I think that the speech does have consequences. And it has consequences for the way the Europeans understand Donald Trump's commitment to security and their security.
And now they're questioning it.
Tillerson went through Europe trying to assure people. I'm sorry, that Madison and Tillerson went through Europe trying to assure.
Who would believe Tillerson? Why should they believe Tillerson?
Well, that's exactly the point I'm trying to make, is that they went through Europe trying to assure these people of that there's still a commitment here. But what Trump did this past week is pop their wishful thinking, that Europe was hoping that the adults in the room would matter. Absolutely. And by making this omission, he clearly sent a signal that whatever Mattis says, whatever Tillerson says, whatever McMaster says, it doesn't really matter because Trump's the president. Right. And when we get back to Article 5, there's nothing automatic about the invoking of Article 5. It requires a political decision in Brussels. So if an attack happens, you have to actually have the alliance agree that an attack has happened. And if the United States does not agree to this, then NATO can't act.
Trump in the past has said that NATO is obsolete. Erica, I want to bring you in. How important is NATO in 2017?
Well, I think it's, I'm not a strong NATO defender. I'm an academic, nor am I a critic, but I think that because we've been a member for nearly 70 years, it gives us a seat at the table for diplomatic negotiations with the Europeans. And if we were not in NATO, if we pulled out of NATO, then therefore we wouldn't have that talking that we can do with the Europeans. More importantly, we'd be stuck with the United States, which would dominate us. And we'd have to defend ourselves against help from the United States. We wouldn't necessarily want them to be involved. So we harness the United States. We try to avoid being entrapped in U.S. wars by participating through NATO. So I'm not defending it, but it is an institution that's been around for a long time. And now they're faced with a United States government that spends 9.5% of its government spending on defense, whereas most of the allies, Finland and Hungary and Germany and Canada, spend 2.4% of government spending. So that leaves us a lot more money to spend on priorities. And what he's suggesting the Republicans are going to do now is cut environmental protection. They're going to cut domestic foreign aid. They're going to cut money to the UN. So when we're talking about terrorism, it's not all fighting terrorism with military spending. You fight terrorism in other ways, by contributing to organizations like the UN and by health, Medicare, making sure that your own population is healthy.
Paul, I want to get you in here. 2017, do we still need NATO?
Well, do we still need it? No, I don't think we do. I say this with some regret as a former military officer who used to be extremely pro-NATO. But when I look at what NATO has actually done in previous years, I don't see it as having had a positive effect. I mean, if we go to what was being said about immigration, well, some of the waves of immigration Europe is facing have been worsened, for instance, by the overthrow of Colonel Gaddafi, which was led by NATO. And also, we've had stories coming out in the UK this week about how the British Home Office was actually allowing Libyans from Manchester to go to Libya in 2011 in order to fight Gaddafi. So that adds to the terrorism problem, and it's destabilized the local area. It's spread destabilization to Africa, into Mali. So NATO is not really having a stabilizing effect on the world more generally, nor is it really been protecting Europeans. And similarly, NATO expansion, I don't see how this has made Europe safer. It has simply antagonized Russia. It's causing tensions. And NATO's attitude to the war in Ukraine, again, isn't really helping. This past couple of weeks, the Ukrainians, for instance, brought in highly repressive measures on the internet. And this kind of thing really doesn't make things better for that country. But what was NATO's response? NATO's response was to say, that's fine. These repressive measures are perfectly justified. So regrettably, and I really do say this with a lot of regret, I do not see NATO as having played a positive role either for the defense of Europe or North America or for general international stability in recent years. And it's rather sad, but that's the way it is.
And he's going to get a lot of disagreement from myself.
Yeah, well, what do you think, Stephen? How important is NATO in 2017?
I think NATO has been quite relevant. I think that it has warts. I think what we could say about NATO is what Churchill said about democracy, which is NATO is the worst form of multilateral military cooperation, except for all the others. That is an important force of cooperation, that institutions adapt and evolve. And so NATO played a major role in helping to cement civilian control of the military amongst the new countries, new democracies of Eastern Europe. The creeping authoritarianism in Poland and Hungary has not been led by the military. The militaries in Eastern Europe have been encouraged to be just like the ones in the West, out of politics, and that's a major contribution. I think if you talk to the people of Bosnia and Kosovo, with the exception of some of the Serbs, you'd find that they would be big fans of NATO. They're very critical of the UN, but big fans of NATO because it helped to stop ethnic cleansing in both of those countries. I think that if you take a look at Canada's place in the world, that if the one reason why we don't really know what a role in Asia is because there's no multilateral military organization to plug ourselves into. So we look at Asia, and we don't know really where we belong, but when we look at Europe, we know where we belong. We know where Canada can have influence. So it's been a major source of Canadian influence in Europe for a long time. And I think that when we talk about Russia, we have to talk about NATO because Russia has been very aggressive towards Ukraine, that NATO has played a major role in trying to deter Russia from going any further. I do think that the expansion of NATO to places like Ukraine and Georgia was a mistaken thought, but it wasn't going to happen. And I think that people who argue that NATO encouraged Russian behavior in Ukraine are mistaken because it happened at exactly the same time that NATO was pulling its forces out of Europe. But it plays a major role right now.
Well, speaking of Russia, here's a quote from Josh Marshall writing in Talking Points memo last week. And he writes, "We're still in the same place, still in a position where the President of the United States is actively seeking to undermine NATO. Each of these aims, each of these goals lines up more or less perfectly with the strategic ambitions of the Russian Federation, which sees NATO as a bulwark of Western/US military strength, hemming Russia in behind borderlands it sees as within its proper sphere of influence and with the EU, representing a liberal internationalist order which it has set itself against. Putin wants a fragmented Europe. Trump does too." Paul, do you agree?
Well, I don't agree with, I agree with some things about how Russians view NATO, but the final statement about both Trump and the Russians wanting a fragmented Europe are simply not true. If you look, for instance, at the recent foreign policy statements of the Russian Federation, there's one word which pops up again and again, so much I actually counted it, it was 26 times, and that word was stability. Russians are very conservative by nature, and they are in their view of foreign policy. And actually what they want is a stable international order. They don't want fragmentation, quite the opposite. And their concern about America and about NATO and so on is a belief that they have contributed to the opposite, to instability by regime change in Ukraine and Syria and Libya and Iraq and so on. And that therefore that they are, in fact, they see themselves very much as the supporters of stability against forces of instability. So this idea that they actually want to fragment Europe is not true, because that would lead to instability, which would be bad for trade, it'd be bad for their internal politics, it'd be bad for the international order, and they are, I think, not in favor of any of those things.
Janice, so you want to get in? Do you agree?
I'm going to disagree. I think, frankly, instability, and the way people use those, just a big red herring, and don't really illuminate the discussion. If you look at Russian strategy, and this has been more or less true, ever since the Cold War began, Russia has a consistent strategy of trying to divide Europe, and trying to divide Europe from the United States and to divide Europe internally. You get ups, you get down, but that is a consistent strategy over time. Certainly some of NATO's decisions to push up against the Russian border were ill-advised, but that doesn't change the fundamental trajectory that we have seen from Russia. If you look at what Russia has done, even in the last 18 months, the interference in domestic elections, not only in the United States, but clearly in France, there's very strong evidence of that. That's done with a political purpose, to diminish political support for candidates who are in support of a transatlantic alliance, who are in support of collective defense, and to support those who are not. There's irrefutable evidence that that's the Russian strategy.
So Russia's trying to push its own agenda.
Of course it is. It's a big power. Europe is its backyard, and its major goal, frankly, is to weaken the institutions which join the United States with Europe. NATO is front and square in that discussion. And that's why what Donald Trump did was so stupid.
Erica?
Well, I think, not to take the Russian perspective or side, but if we look at the Russian perspective over time, they've been encircled by a growing alliance. Every party and every leader in Russia has been opposed to NATO enlargement. President Putin has moved in reaction to NATO, has moved nuclear-capable missiles into Kaliningrad, which is their enclave to get onto the Baltic Sea. And as well, he's looking at Trump modernizing at a cost of $1 trillion their nuclear weapons, plus remodernizing the B-61 bombs that are deployed in 5 nuclear states. So not to take Russia's side, but I think we have to be a little bit sympathetic and recognize that we're dealing with an insecure, fearful adversary, and maybe it's not right to build a new central front along Belarus and to threaten and to say we're going to defend ourselves so strongly. Maybe we need to, and I've been to NATO 6 times, and it's fascinating because in the corridors of NATO, you have the Russians, you have so many countries now. It's totally different from during the Cold War. That's a place that we can jaw, not war, 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 as Winston Churchill said.
Stephen, do you agree?
I think that the problem with looking, I agree more with Janice than with the others, because the idea of Russia's pushing stability forgets that Russia has been supporting separatism in its neighbors, whether that was Ukraine, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia in Georgia long before Kosovo, Transnistria in Moldova, again, long before Kosovo, that Russia has traditionally pursued its interests. And its interest is not always stability. It depends on who is winning and who is losing a particular battle in a country. So it supports Assad, not because Assad is a force for stability in Syria, but because Assad favors the Russians. And you can go through back and forth across Eastern Europe, the Middle East, about who they side with. And it's not about stability. It's about who is more likely to support the Russians. And so that's the natural way of international relations. And we understand that, but the problem here is that Russia has been making the nuclear threats. Yes, the United States is putting more money into renewing its nuclear weapons, but it's been Russia that's actually been wielding the nuclear threats, that they've been the ones who've been threatening not just NATO, but Sweden and Finland and other countries with testing, practicing airstrikes on the Swedish capital just to let the Swedish know that what would happen in case the Swedes get too close to NATO. So it's about the Russians been pushing these things.
Erica, I just wanted to do a hot pursuit. It's Trump who has been testing missiles to scare the North Koreans and firing them. It's Trump who's talking about spending $1 trillion on modernizing nuclear weapons. So it's our neighbors, unfortunately, and I could take the same story that you just said about their sphere of influence and say the same thing about the U.S. sphere of influence. So we're just arguing.
The only thing I would say is that all you talk about Trump has been since 2017. He's been president for 100 days. Putin's been at this for far longer than Trump.
Everybody does these things. I mean, there's nothing uniquely Russian about this. For instance, when there was this example of Russian plane buzzing a American Aegis cruiser in the Baltic Sea. What people didn't point out was that the reason it was there was it was part of this anti-missile defense system, and it was doing exercises in effect to see how it could suppress Russian missile defense systems in the Baltics. And this is odd because America and NATO insist that this missile defense system is directed against Iran, but here they had part of a system actually exercising off the coast of Kaliningrad. And so if you're sitting in Moscow, you know, what NATO's saying doesn't make a lot of sense. You know, they're saying they're doing it against Iran, but then they're exercising this system directly next to your shore. So everybody engages in these posturings. I'm not in favor of them, whether they're done by the Russians or they're done by the Americans, but unfortunately NATO contributes to this tension just as much as the Russians do.
I want to move on, but
there's guilt on both sides.
I want to move on, but I see Janice wants to get in.
I want to move on just a little bit here too, Nam, and just to switch the channel just 1 minute, and to talk about the American-German relationship, right? Because NATO has been a very important part historically of Western strategy toward Germany. NATO is actually one of the real purposes of NATO, which we don't talk about. We always talk about Russia, but actually a key goal of NATO was to embed Germany in a broader structure of democratic society. And that came out of World War II and was made really important after the unification of Germany, because Germany now is the big power in Europe, and Germans themselves feel comfortable and more secure when NATO is functioning well. What did this president do? I mean, and my jaw is still dropping in amazement. Goes in, not only does not talk about Article 5, but goes after, attacks Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, to the point, and she's not a
What
woman.
do you think of her response by saying that now?
I think she was ill-advised, actually. She was ill-advised because...
By saying that
she should not have responded when you have somebody like Trump who's so erratic, even though what she was saying is true from her
that Europe
perspective,
has to take care of Europe.
that Europe has to take care of itself. And again, think about that message for Europeans who worry about a big, strong, united, powerful Germany, and always balanced against that with the United States. But she shouldn't have said anything. And he, of course, responds as all bullies respond. When you provoke them, they respond. And so you now have probably the worst situation. The last tough one was between Germany and the United States over Iraq. It is nothing like this. The worst situation we've ever had between the President of the United States and the Chancellor of Germany. She's going to have to pull back now, but that's where these words have real consequences.
I was quite proud of her, actually, and I thought she stood up to a bully. And when you stand up to a bully, one person, she's the leader of the European.
But some people are saying
now.
it's to further her own agenda because the elections are coming up in September.
Well,
so is she doing it for a domestic audience?
Well, then but the thing is, she's standing up in high heels and she's saying, no, you can't do this. And I thought, I admired her actually for doing that, and she might get followers, people who are more willing to stand up, because right now people are afraid.
I wasn't sure who that was.
Well, this is the problem.
Okay, Steve, yeah?
This is the problem, is that by Trump making these noises, he's making himself a political issue with all of Europe. And so politicians are going to have to compete to get distance from Trump. And that's going to make it harder for NATO to cooperate in any further endeavor, because any politician who needs to get approval, which almost all of them have to get approval through their legislatures to do anything serious, will have to get parties to agree to it. And by having it be something that might be cooperative with Trump, it becomes much harder. It was much easier for Obama to get cooperation from Europe because he was widely popular, so parties within each political system were willing to stand next to Obama. They had a harder time cooperating with Bush because he was unpopular. Trump is far more unpopular in Europe than Bush ever was, and so any effort now in the future to cooperate is going to be much harder, because you're going to have parties that are going to compete to be distant from Trump, not to be close to the United States. So what Merkel was doing was an electoral endeavor, of course, but she's not going to be alone in this, and this is the Trump factor. He's going to make it much harder for countries in Europe to cooperate because he's going to be poisoned domestically.
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to talk about what Canada's role should be in NATO. So just a few minutes from each of you. We'll start with Erica.
Well, sure. I mean, reacting to your comment, we believe in multilateralism. It seems like he believes in unilateralism and almost isolationism. And so in the long run, we're going to be joined by other countries. Justin Trudeau played his cards very well there, I thought, by not attacking, but also just not saying we're going to commit to 2%. And the same at the G7. So I think in the long run, if we continue with our foreign policy, which has always been to be a member of more organizations than any other country in the world, NATO is one of the important ones, but we'll work through the OSCE, and we can work through other organizations like NORAD. So this is early on in the Trump era, and we don't know how long it'll last, but we're playing a good game right now.
Okay, and Paul, we just have a few minutes left. What should Canada's role in the future of NATO be?
Well, I would say that at the moment the key thing which is required is a dampening down of rhetoric, a calming of emotions, a relaxing of military tensions and so on. So I think what Canada should be doing is pushing its allies in that direction rather than ramping up the rhetoric, increasing attention, deploying more troops and so on and so forth.
And Janice?
You know, we are the neighbor of the most powerful and erratic government in the world today, and we are the most vulnerable to that government. So being a member of an alliance where we have friends, where we can work through that alliance and try to balance the pressures that are coming at us, which are very serious, on trade, which can flatten this country, frankly. We have to be serious. And I think Justin Trudeau, unlike Angela Merkel, has behaved in a mature and responsible way because he understands the risks, and he's been very skilled in the way he's using multilateral diplomacy to balance those risks.
And 10 seconds for you, Stephen. Sorry about that.
Well, I think that the proof will be in the DPR, the Defense Policy Review, because that's something that the Americans are paying attention to. Will Canada commit to spending more in its military? This is not a popular issue in Canada, but if the Defense Review has some promise of getting not to 2%, but making progress, that's the best we can do. But yes, it's going to be about managing the elephant that's rampaging, and the best we can do is not to poke at it too much.
That's right.
Stephen, Paul, Erica, and Janice, thank you all so much for being here, and we welcome your insights and appreciate them.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.